Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't just a story about a pharmaceutical mistake. This isn't simply about corporate negligence or regulatory failure. This is a story about trust, about the implicit contract between medicine and humanity, about what happens when that contract shatters into 10,000 broken bodies, 10,000 shattered lives, 10,000 families who will never be whole again. Between the years of 1957 and 1962, a drug called thalidomide swept across 46 nations like a benevolent wind. It promised safety. It promised sleep. It promised relief to expectant mothers battling the nausea of early pregnancy. What it delivered was one of the most catastrophic pharmaceutical disasters in human history. Over 10,000 children born with limbs that ended where they should have begun, with organs twisted and malformed, with faces that couldn't fully form, with bodies that would struggle for every moment of every day. The stakes were not merely medical, they were existential. Thalidomide changed how we think about drug safety. It transformed regulations that govern medicine worldwide. It revealed the hubris of an industry that believed itself beyond the reach of consequences. And it left behind survivors who, now in their 60s, still carry the physical manifestations of a chemical compound their mothers took in good faith. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories back into the light to honor those whose suffering shaped the world we inherit. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Are you in London, where some of the fiercest legal battles were fought? In Germany, where this compound was first synthesized? In Australia, where doctors first connected the dots? Or perhaps in the United States, where one woman's stubbornness saved a nation from catastrophe? Phone away. Distractions silenced. We have a long journey ahead, through laboratories and hospital wards, through courtrooms and parliamentary chambers, through the wreckage of lives forever altered and the slow, painful reconstruction that followed. Let's begin. In the beginning, there was war. This is where our story truly starts, not in the gleaming laboratories of pharmaceutical innovation, but in the rubble of post-war Germany. The year is 1946. Europe lies devastated, cities reduced to skeletal remains, economies shattered, industries obliterated. In this landscape of reconstruction, a small soap factory opened its doors in Stahlberg near Aachen in what would become West Germany. The company was called Chemie Grünenthal. Its founders were businessmen, not scientists. They made soap, a commodity desperately needed in a continent trying to wash away the residue of catastrophe. But soap offered limited margins, limited possibilities. The pharmaceutical industry, by contrast, promised lucrative returns. Post-war populations needed medication, antibiotics, pain relievers, sedatives to calm the collective trauma. By the early 1950s, Chemie Grünenthal had pivoted entirely into pharmaceuticals. They hired chemists, built laboratories, began synthesizing compounds. The first chapter of this story takes us into those laboratories in 1953, where a research team was working on antihistamines. They were not particularly looking for something revolutionary. They were simply experimenting, as pharmaceutical companies do, combining molecules, testing reactions, hoping for something marketable. What they created was a compound they labeled K17. Later, it would be renamed thalidomide. The structure was deceptively simple, a glutaramide derivative. It looked, on paper, unremarkable. But when tested on laboratory animals, something extraordinary appeared. The compound was virtually non-toxic. Researchers attempted to establish a lethal dose. They couldn't. They fed enormous quantities to rats, mice, guinea pigs. The animals survived. They showed no adverse effects, no organ damage, no behavioral changes. This apparent safety profile was, in the pharmaceutical world of the mid-1950s, something of a holy grail. Sedatives and sleeping pills of that era, primarily barbiturates, carried significant risks. Barbiturate overdoses killed. They were the preferred method of suicide for those who had access. A sleeping pill that couldn't kill you, even in massive doses, represented a transformative breakthrough. Clinical testing began in the spring of 1955. The testing protocols were, by modern standards, shockingly inadequate. There were no randomized controlled trials, no systematic safety monitoring, no pregnancy testing despite the fact that the drug would eventually be marketed primarily to women. Thalidomide was tested on a few dozen people, mostly men, for short periods. The results seemed promising. People slept. They woke refreshed. Side effects appeared minimal. On October 1, 1957, Chemie Grünenthal released thalidomide onto the West German market under the brand name Contergan. The marketing was aggressive. This was not merely a sleeping pill, the company claimed. This was the safest sedative ever created. So safe it could be sold over the counter without prescription. So safe that even a child could take it without risk. So safe that pregnant women, those suffering the misery of morning sickness, could find relief without fear. The advertising campaigns featured smiling mothers, happy children. The tagline promised harmless, completely safe, a miracle of modern chemistry. Pharmacies stocked it prominently. Doctors recommended it enthusiastically. Within months, Contergan became one of the best-selling medications in Germany. Sales began to rival aspirin, but Chemie Grünenthal's ambitions extended far beyond Germany. They knew that the global pharmaceutical market offered exponentially greater profits. Through the late 1950s, they began licensing the drug to pharmaceutical companies around the world. By 1960, thalidomide was being marketed in 46 countries under at least 37 different brand names. In the United Kingdom, it was Distaval. In Canada, Kevatin. In Australia, Distaval again. In Japan, Isomin. Each nation's pharmaceutical distributor launched their own marketing campaigns, each echoing the same message: unprecedented safety. The drug found its largest market among pregnant women. Morning sickness, that persistent nausea of early pregnancy, had few effective treatments. Most remedies were folk cures or medications with questionable safety profiles. Thalidomide seemed like an answer to prayer. Doctors prescribed it liberally. Pharmacists recommended it routinely. Women took it gratefully, believing they were making the safest possible choice for themselves and their unborn children. What none of them knew, what nobody suspected in those early years, was that thalidomide possessed a terrible hidden property. The compound is what chemists call chiral. It exists in two mirror-image forms, like left and right hands. One form, the R enantiomer, provided the sedative effects. The other form, the S enantiomer, was benign. But here's the crucial detail that wouldn't be understood for decades. In the human body, these two forms interconvert. Even if you could manufacture pure R-thalidomide, it would partially transform into S-thalidomide inside the patient. And during pregnancy in the developing embryo, the S form wreaked havoc. The first thalidomide-affected baby was born in Germany on Christmas Day, 1956. The mother was an employee of Chemie Grünenthal. She had taken the drug during early pregnancy. Her child was born with severe limb malformations. The company was notified. They dismissed it as coincidence. One case. Statistically insignificant, but it wasn't one case. Through 1957, 1958, 1959, babies continued to be born with bizarre deformities. The condition, though rare, had a medical name: phocomelia, from the Greek words for seal limbs. Children were born with hands emerging directly from shoulders, feet sprouting from hips. In severe cases, limbs were completely absent, leaving only small, flipper-like appendages. Phocomelia was so rare that most obstetricians never encountered it in their entire careers. Historical medical literature documented perhaps a handful of cases per decade globally. But starting in 1959, obstetric wards across Western Europe began seeing multiple cases per month. Something was happening, something unprecedented. However, identifying the cause proved extraordinarily difficult. Pregnant women consume numerous substances: food, vitamins, multiple medications. Environmental exposures vary wildly. Establishing causation in teratology, the study of birth defects, requires connecting a specific exposure to a specific outcome across multiple cases. And thalidomide was so widely used, so universally recommended as safe, that it didn't initially appear on anyone's radar as a potential culprit. The horror grew slowly, case by case, year by year. Each birth of a child with phocomelia was treated as a tragic individual occurrence. Parents were told their child's condition was a random genetic accident, a cruel roll of nature's dice. No one yet saw the pattern. No one yet understood that a generation was being quietly crippled, one birth at a time, by a drug that promised to be harmless. But then, something changed. The world would never be the same after November 1961. This is when the pattern finally became impossible to ignore, when individual tragedies coalesced into undeniable catastrophe. The second chapter reveals the medical detective work that ultimately exposed thalidomide. In Hamburg, Germany, a pediatrician named Widukind Lenz was becoming increasingly disturbed. He specialized in genetics and congenital abnormalities, and through 1960 and into 1961, he was seeing an explosion of phocomelia cases. His clinic alone documented dozens of children with limb malformations. This wasn't random genetic variation. This was an epidemic. Lenz began what epidemiologists call shoe-leather investigation. He went door to door, visiting the families of affected children. He interviewed mothers extensively, probing every detail of their pregnancies. What had they eaten? What medications had they taken? When had they taken them? What was their occupation? Their environment, their habits. A pattern emerged. Nearly every mother had taken thalidomide during the first trimester of pregnancy. Specifically, they had taken it between the 34th and 50th day after their last menstrual period. This narrow window, it turned out, coincided with the critical period of limb development in the embryo. During these 16 days, the tiny buds that would become arms and legs were forming. Thalidomide crossing the placental barrier disrupted this development catastrophically. On November 15, 1961, Lenz contacted Chemie Grunenthal. He told them he believed thalidomide was causing birth defects. He presented his evidence. The company's response was defensive, dismissive. They challenged his methodology. They questioned his conclusions. They suggested he might be motivated by desire for publicity. But Lenz wasn't the only doctor connecting these dots. Simultaneously, halfway across the world, an Australian obstetrician named William McBride was conducting his own investigation. McBride practiced at the Crown Street Women's Hospital in Sydney. Like Lenz, he was seeing unprecedented numbers of babies with limb malformations. Like Lenz, he began interviewing mothers systematically. McBride reached the same conclusion independently. On December 16, 1961, he submitted a letter to The Lancet, one of the world's most prestigious medical journals. His letter, published that same month, stated clearly, congenital abnormalities are present in approximately 1.5% of babies. In recent months, I have observed that the incidence of multiple severe abnormalities in babies delivered of women who were given the drug thalidomide has been almost 20%. The evidence was now public. The medical community could no longer ignore it. On November 26, 1961, the day before Lenz's findings reached the press, Chemie Grunenthal withdrew Contergan from the German market. They claimed they were acting out of an abundance of caution. They still didn't fully acknowledge the connection, but the withdrawal spoke volumes. Other countries followed rapidly. The United Kingdom withdrew thalidomide on December 2nd, Canada on December 4th, Australia on November 29th. Within weeks, the drug vanished from pharmacy shelves across the developed world, but the damage was done. The children who would be affected had already been conceived. Their mothers had already taken the pills. Through 1962, birth defects continued to appear, the final wave of a chemical tide that had already crested. How many were affected? The exact number remains disputed. Estimates suggest at least 10,000 children worldwide were born with thalidomide embryopathy. Some researchers believe the true number is significantly higher, perhaps 15,000 or more. Many severely affected babies were stillborn. Others died shortly after birth. Thousands of families chose to institutionalize their affected children, and many of these cases went undocumented. The range of defects was staggering. Phocomelia was the most visible, the most iconic, but thalidomide affected virtually every developing organ system. Children were born with heart defects, malformed kidneys, absent or malformed ears leading to deafness, eye abnormalities, facial paralysis, gastrointestinal malformations. The drug didn't just shorten limbs. It disrupted fundamental development across multiple systems simultaneously. The severity varied based on precise timing. Women who took thalidomide on day 34 to day 38 of pregnancy tended to have children with upper limb defects. Days 38 to 42 affected lower limbs. Days 42 to 47 produced both upper and lower limb abnormalities. The drug's teratogenic window was brutally precise. But here's something crucial that often gets lost in the historical narrative. Not every woman who took thalidomide during pregnancy had an affected child. The drug's teratogenicity, while devastating, was not absolute. Estimates suggest that approximately 20 to 30% of pregnancies exposed to thalidomide during the critical window resulted in birth defects. This statistical variability made the initial detection even more difficult. It allowed the drug to remain on the market for years while cases accumulated slowly. Because for every affected birth, there were 2 or 3 apparently normal outcomes that seemed to vindicate the drug's safety. Moving into the 1960s, the geographical distribution of thalidomide babies reflected the drug's marketing patterns. Germany had the highest number of cases, approximately 5,000 to 6,000 children. The United Kingdom followed with approximately 400 to 500 documented cases. Japan documented several hundred. Australia, Canada, and Sweden each had dozens to hundreds. Smaller numbers appeared in virtually every country where the drug had been marketed. One nation was conspicuously absent from this list, the United States, and thereby hangs one of the most remarkable stories in the entire thalidomide saga, a story of bureaucratic obstinacy that became heroism. In September 1960, the William S. Merrill Company applied to the United States Food and Drug Administration for approval to market thalidomide under the brand name Kevadin. The application landed on the desk of Dr. Frances Oldham Kelsey, a relatively new FDA reviewer. It was her first month on the job. The application seemed routine. Thalidomide was already approved in dozens of countries. It had an established safety record, or so it appeared, but Kelsey had concerns. She had earned her Ph.D. studying pharmacology, and something about the application troubled her. The clinical trials seemed inadequate. The safety data appeared incomplete. There were reports, scattered and unconfirmed, of peripheral neuropathy in patients taking thalidomide long-term, nerve damage. That suggested the drug wasn't as harmless as Merrill claimed. Kelsey requested more data. Merrill provided additional information. She requested more. The company grew frustrated, then angry. They lobbied her supervisors. They accused her of unreasonable delays. They pointed to thalidomide's success in Europe. They brought pressure, political pressure, corporate pressure. Kelsey refused to budge. She wanted better studies. She wanted clearer evidence. She wanted, above all, specific data on the drug's safety during pregnancy. This was 1960, an era when pharmaceutical companies routinely dismissed concerns about pregnancy as overcautious feminine anxiety. But Kelsey insisted, and crucially, her supervisors supported her. Month after month, through 1960 and into 1961, she continued to request additional information, continued to find the evidence insufficient. Then, in November 1961, as Kelsey was still reviewing the application, the news broke from Germany. Thalidomide caused birth defects, devastating, life-altering malformations. The drug was being withdrawn worldwide. Kelsey's stubbornness had prevented an American catastrophe. There were, nonetheless, some American thalidomide babies. Merrill had distributed the drug experimentally to over 1,000 doctors across the United States, who had prescribed it to approximately 20,000 patients, including pregnant women. This practice, called investigational use, operated in a regulatory gray zone. Approximately 17 American babies were born with thalidomide embryopathy, mostly to mothers who had received the drug through these experimental programs or had obtained it overseas. In August 1962, President John F. Kennedy awarded Dr. Frances Kelsey the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service. She became a national hero, the conscientious bureaucrat who had saved America. Her story was covered extensively in the press. And that publicity, that public awareness of how close the United States had come to its own thalidomide disaster, created the political momentum for the most sweeping pharmaceutical reform in American history. In October 1962, Congress passed the Kefauver-Harris Amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The amendments fundamentally transformed drug regulation. For the first time, pharmaceutical companies were required to prove not just safety, but efficacy before marketing a drug. They had to conduct adequate and well-controlled investigations. They had to monitor adverse events systematically. They had to obtain informed consent from research subjects. The FDA received authority to inspect manufacturing facilities, to demand post-market surveillance, to withdraw drugs that proved dangerous. These reforms rippled globally. Other nations adopted similar regulations. The thalidomide disaster had revealed that pharmaceutical safety couldn't be assumed, couldn't be taken on faith. It required rigorous testing, transparent reporting, and regulatory vigilance. A tragedy that crippled thousands of children became the foundation for drug safety standards that have, arguably, saved millions of lives in the decades since. However, for the families living through this catastrophe, regulatory reform offered cold comfort. They were dealing with immediate, overwhelming challenges. How do you parent a child without arms? How do you help a daughter learn to write when her hands emerge from her shoulders? How do you prepare a son for a world that will stare, that will recoil, that will struggle to accommodate his differences? The early 1960s were a period of profound adaptation and struggle for thalidomide families. Many hospitals encouraged immediate institutionalization. Doctors told parents their children would never lead meaningful lives. Social pressure was immense. Some families abandoned affected children. Others fought fiercely, demanding educational accommodation, developing adaptive technologies, creating support networks. The children themselves, the first generation of thalidomide survivors, faced challenges that extended far beyond their physical disabilities. They grew up as visible symbols of pharmaceutical failure. Their bodies became political statements, evidence in legal battles, subjects of medical fascination. Privacy was nearly impossible. Photographers documented them extensively. Researchers studied them. Their lives were never entirely their own. What happened next would shock the world. The third chapter of this story takes us into courtrooms and corporate boardrooms, into the brutal arithmetic of compensation and accountability. Because once the cause was established, once thalidomide's role was undeniable, the question became, who pays? In Germany, Chemie Grünenthal faced immediate legal action. Families of affected children filed lawsuits. The company's defense strategy was aggressive and, to modern sensibilities, appalling. They denied that adequate evidence linked thalidomide to birth defects. They claimed the malformations might have been caused by other factors. They argued that no drug could be proven absolutely safe. They fought every claim viciously. The legal battle dragged on for years. German courts moved slowly. The burden of proof fell on individual families, who had to demonstrate that their specific child's defects resulted from thalidomide exposure. This was emotionally exhausting and financially ruinous. Many families lacked resources to sustain prolonged litigation. In 1968, Chemie Grünenthal reached a settlement. The terms were meager. The company agreed to pay approximately 100 million Deutsche Marks into a compensation fund, to be distributed among German thalidomide victims. But the fund was structured as a loan, which Grunenthal would repay over time. The company admitted no wrongdoing. They framed the payment as humanitarian assistance, not legal liability. The settlement amount, divided among thousands of victims, provided each affected individual with a relatively small sum. It was enough to cover some medical expenses, some adaptive equipment. It was nowhere near enough to fund a lifetime of care, repeated surgeries, ongoing therapy, lost earning potential. The situation in the United Kingdom followed a different but equally frustrating trajectory. Distillers Company, the British pharmaceutical firm that had marketed thalidomide as Distaval, initially offered minuscule compensation amounts. In 1962, they offered payments to 62 families. The amounts were insultingly low, typically a few £100s per child. Most families refused. The standoff continued for years. Distillers maintained that they bore no legal responsibility. They argued that the drug had been adequately tested by Chemie Grunenthal. They claimed they had simply distributed a product manufactured and validated by others. British law at the time made product liability cases extraordinarily difficult. The families needed to prove not just that thalidomide caused the defects, but that distillers had been negligent in their testing and marketing. This is where journalism entered the story as a powerful force. The Sunday Times, under editor Harold Evans, launched an aggressive investigative campaign in the early 1970s. Their reporting exposed distillers' tactics. They revealed internal company documents showing that distillers had ignored warning signs. They demonstrated that the original testing had been grossly inadequate. They turned public opinion decisively against the company. The Sunday Times campaign had a specific target, forcing distillers to offer adequate compensation. The newspaper published heartrending profiles of thalidomide children and their families. They detailed the daily challenges, the medical costs, the emotional toll. They contrasted these human stories with distillers' corporate profits, which remained substantial throughout this period. Public pressure mounted. Consumer boycotts of distillers' products began. Shareholders started questioning the company's stance. Politicians took notice. The campaign worked. In 1972, distillers agreed to establish a more substantial compensation fund. The settlement was structured as ongoing payments rather than lump sums, recognizing that thalidomide survivors would need financial support throughout their lives. The total package was approximately £32 million, a significant sum at the time. But spread across hundreds of victims over decades, it still represented a fraction of what comprehensive care would cost, and distillers still admitted no legal liability. The payment was framed as ex gratia, a gesture of goodwill, not an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Australia's resolution came later, in the 21st century. For decades, Australian thalidomide survivors received minimal support. The distributor, Distillers Company through its Australian subsidiary, had paid small initial settlements and then largely disappeared from public view. Survivors struggled. Many lived in poverty. Their health problems multiplied as they aged, and the costs of care escalated. In 2013, survivors launched a class action lawsuit against Diageo, the multinational corporation that had absorbed distillers decades earlier. The lawsuit argued that Diageo, as the successor company, bore responsibility for distillers' actions. After months of negotiation, a settlement was reached. Diageo agreed to pay approximately $89 million Australian dollars, distributed among Australian and New Zealand survivors. Like previous settlements, it came without admission of liability, but it represented recognition that survivors deserved support. Similar battles played out across dozens of countries. In Japan, thalidomide victims received compensation through a government industry fund established in the 1970s. In Canada, negotiations stretched across decades, with various settlement packages offered at different times. In Spain, thalidomide survivors face particular difficulties because the drug had been marketed there under multiple names by different companies, making it hard to even identify who should be held accountable. Some Spanish survivors are still fighting for adequate compensation. The legal principle that thalidomide established, or rather failed to establish definitively, remains troubling. In most jurisdictions, pharmaceutical companies never admitted fault. Settlements were structured to avoid creating legal precedents. The cases were resolved through negotiation and public pressure rather than definitive court rulings on liability. This meant that, legally speaking, thalidomide never established the clear principle that drug manufacturers bear responsibility for birth defects caused by their inadequately tested products. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, thalidomide survivors faced additional challenges beyond compensation disputes. They were entering adulthood in a world unprepared for their needs. Employment discrimination was rampant. Accessibility standards were minimal. Public buildings lacked ramps. Employers routinely refused to hire individuals with visible disabilities. Educational opportunities were limited. Many survivors were steered toward sheltered workshops or told their employment prospects were essentially nil. Yet many survivors defied these low expectations. They became teachers, artists, musicians, athletes, advocates. Thomas Quasthoff, a German bass baritone born without arms due to thalidomide, became an internationally renowned opera singer. Matt Fraser, a British actor with phocomelia, built a successful career in film and television. Louise Metis in the UK became a powerful advocate for disability rights. These individuals and hundreds of others demonstrated that thalidomide embryopathy, while profoundly disabling, did not define a person's potential. But their success stories shouldn't obscure the broader reality. Many survivors struggled with poverty, isolation, and limited opportunities. Their physical challenges multiplied with age. Repetitive strain injuries from a lifetime of using prosthetics or adapting their bodies to perform tasks. Chronic pain. Arthritis developing prematurely in joints subjected to abnormal stresses. Psychological impacts of living as perpetual symbols of pharmaceutical failure. Support systems varied dramatically by country. The United Kingdom established the Thalidomide Trust in 1973, funded by the Distillers Settlement, to provide ongoing financial assistance and coordinate services for British survivors. Germany's foundation offered similar support, but in many countries, survivors received little beyond initial compensation payments. They were left to navigate healthcare systems, social services, and daily life largely on their own. The 1980s also brought a strange development. Thalidomide began to be reconsidered as a therapeutic agent. Researchers discovered that the drug possessed powerful anti-inflammatory and immunomodulatory properties. Despite its horrific history, it showed promise for treating certain severe conditions. As we approach the modern age, the fourth chapter reveals a remarkable and controversial transformation. Thalidomide, the drug that had become synonymous with pharmaceutical disaster, began a medical resurrection. The first hints of thalidomide's therapeutic potential emerged in the 1960s, even as the birth defect scandal was unfolding. Dr. Jacob Sheskin, an Israeli physician treating leprosy patients, discovered almost accidentally that thalidomide dramatically relieved a painful complication of leprosy called erythema nodosum leprosum, or ENL. This condition causes inflammatory nodules, fever, and excruciating pain. Standard treatments offered limited relief, but thalidomide worked rapidly and effectively. Sheskin published his findings in 1965. The medical community reacted with profound ambivalence. On one hand, here was a treatment for a condition that caused immense suffering. On the other hand, this was thalidomide, the drug that had crippled thousands. Could it ever be used safely? Should it be used at all? Through the 1970s and 80s, research continued quietly. Thalidomide showed promise for various autoimmune and inflammatory conditions. Behçet's disease, which causes recurring mouth and genital ulcers. Systemic lupus erythematosus. certain severe skin conditions, complications of HIV/AIDS. The drug appeared to suppress tumor necrosis factor alpha, a key inflammatory mediator, and to inhibit angiogenesis, the formation of new blood vessels. That angiogenesis inhibition proved particularly intriguing to cancer researchers. Tumors require new blood vessel growth to sustain themselves. A drug that prevents angiogenesis could potentially starve tumors. In the 1990s, researchers began testing thalidomide for multiple myeloma, a cancer of plasma cells in bone marrow. The results were remarkable. In 1999, Dr. Bart Barlogee and colleagues at the University of Arkansas published a landmark study showing that thalidomide produced significant responses in patients with relapsed or refractory multiple myeloma. These were patients for whom other treatments had failed. Thalidomide offered new hope. In 1998, the FDA approved thalidomide for treatment of ENL in leprosy patients. It was the drug's first legal approval in the United States. The approval came with the most stringent safety program ever imposed on a prescription medication. The program, called STEPS, System for Thalidomide Education and Prescribing Safety, required extensive education, mandatory contraception, regular pregnancy testing, restricted distribution, and detailed record keeping. In 2006, the FDA approved thalidomide for multiple myeloma. Again, strict safety protocols applied. Women of childbearing potential had to use 2 forms of contraception simultaneously. Men taking the drug had to use condoms, as thalidomide appears in semen. Prescribers had to complete special training. Pharmacies had to be specially certified to dispense it. Thalidomide's modern use raises profound ethical questions. On one hand, the drug genuinely helps people suffering from serious conditions. Multiple myeloma patients have lived years longer because of thalidomide and its derivative compounds, lenalidomide and pomalidomide. Leprosy patients have found relief from painful ENL episodes. The drug has legitimate, valuable medical applications. On the other hand, every prescription represents a risk. Despite safety protocols, despite education programs, despite elaborate precautions, pregnancies have occurred in women taking thalidomide. And wherever thalidomide is used, birth defects follow. This is nowhere more evident than in Brazil. Brazil has the world's second highest burden of leprosy, after India. Thalidomide has been used there extensively since the 1960s for treating ENL, and Brazil continues to see new thalidomide babies born decades after the original disaster. Between 1965 and 2010, at least 100 Brazilian children were born with thalidomide embryopathy. These are post-disaster cases, born long after the drug's dangers were known. The reasons are complex. Some women didn't understand the warnings. Some took medication they found at home without realizing what it was. Some became pregnant unexpectedly while on treatment. Some lived in remote areas with limited access to contraception and pregnancy testing. The Brazilian government implemented strict controls. In 2011, they introduced regulations requiring comprehensive patient education, mandatory pregnancy prevention programs, and controlled distribution. But cases continued. In 2019, researchers documented additional recent births of affected children. The Brazilian situation highlights a troubling reality. Thalidomide cannot be completely safely used in any population where women of childbearing potential have access to it. The safety protocols are only as effective as their implementation, and implementation depends on healthcare infrastructure, patient education, cultural context, and individual compliance. In resource-limited settings, or in situations where women lack autonomy over their reproductive choices, thalidomide remains a persistent threat. Meanwhile, thalidomide survivors from the original epidemic were entering middle age. The 1990s and early 2000s brought new challenges. Their bodies, which had adapted to significant disabilities, began to break down. Repetitive stress injuries, chronic pain, degenerative joint conditions, the physical toll of a lifetime of compensatory movements and prosthetic use. Many survivors also faced mental health challenges. Depression rates were high. Anxiety disorders were common. Some struggled with post-traumatic stress from a lifetime of medical interventions, social stigma, and economic precarity. Support services, where they existed, were often inadequate to address these complex needs. In 2009, Kemi Grunenthal issued its first formal apology. 50 years after thalidomide was first marketed, the company's CEO, Harold Stock, publicly apologized to survivors. He expressed regret for the company's initial denial and its aggressive legal tactics. He acknowledged the profound suffering thalidomide had caused. Many survivors and advocates found the apology inadequate and too late. It came without any increase in compensation. It came decades after most survivors' most difficult years, when financial support would have been most impactful. It came after many of the most severely affected individuals had already died. Some viewed it as a public relations gesture rather than genuine contrition. In 2012, Kemi Grunenthal unveiled a memorial at its headquarters in Germany. The sculpture depicted a child with thalidomide-related limb malformations. The inscription expressed regret and asked for forgiveness. Some survivors participated in the memorial's dedication. Others boycotted, viewing it as an attempt to achieve closure without adequate accountability. The legacy questions persisted. Should thalidomide be available at all, given its irreducible risks? Some argued for a complete ban. Others contended that such a ban would deny effective treatment to people suffering from serious conditions. The debate continues, unresolved, balancing individual benefit against collective risk. Parallel to these debates, scientific understanding of thalidomide's mechanism of action finally advanced. For decades, researchers had struggled to explain how the drug caused birth defects. The molecule didn't obviously interact with DNA. It didn't fit standard teratogenic profiles. The mechanism remained mysterious. In 2010, Japanese researchers led by Dr. Hiroshi Handa made a breakthrough. They identified cereblin, a protein involved in limb development, as thalidomide's primary target. Thalidomide binds to cereblin, changing its behavior in ways that disrupt normal embryonic development. This discovery came 53 years after the drug was first marketed. Further research refined this understanding. Thalidomide doesn't just bind cereblin, it changes how cereblin interacts with other proteins. Specifically, it causes cereblin to target certain transcription factors for degradation. During embryonic development, these transcription factors are essential for limb bud formation. When thalidomide causes their premature destruction, limbs fail to develop properly. This mechanism also explained thalidomide's anti-cancer properties. In myeloma cells, the same protein degradation pathway that disrupts embryonic development can destroy proteins that cancer cells need to survive. The drug's teratogenicity and its therapeutic effects stem from the same molecular action, just in different contexts. In 2018, researchers at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute published detailed structural studies showing exactly how thalidomide binds to cereblin and alters its substrate specificity. This work opened possibilities for designing new drugs that might have thalidomide's therapeutic benefits without its teratogenic effects. Such drugs remain in development. Today, we still grapple with the legacy of thalidomide in multiple dimensions. The fifth chapter brings us to the present moment, where survivors now in their 60s face new challenges, where the drug continues to be used and misused, where the lessons of the disaster are both remembered and forgotten. Thalidomide survivors are aging. This is a population that was never expected to age, at least not in large numbers. In the 1960s, medical professionals predicted that many severely affected children wouldn't survive to adulthood. Those predictions proved largely wrong. Survivors lived. But they're now living with bodies that have endured extraordinary stresses for 6 decades. The medical term is accelerated aging. Survivors are experiencing arthritis, joint deterioration, cardiovascular problems, and other age-related conditions 10 to 20 years earlier than the general population. A 55-year-old survivor might have the musculoskeletal profile of a 75-year-old. This premature aging results from cumulative biomechanical stress. Joints used abnormally for decades develop arthritis. Spines curved to compensate for missing limbs develop severe problems. Repetitive strain injuries become disabling. Healthcare systems have struggled to address these needs. Many survivors require increasingly extensive care, multiple surgeries, pain management, mental health support, adaptive equipment that must be regularly replaced and upgraded, home modifications as mobility declines. Yet compensation funds established decades ago often prove insufficient for these escalating costs. In the United Kingdom, the Thalidomide Trust negotiated additional settlements with Diageo in 2009 and 2010, recognizing that survivors' needs were growing. The British government also committed additional funding. Similar negotiations occurred in other countries, but gaps remain. Many survivors face financial insecurity as they age, particularly those unable to work or whose employment was limited by discrimination. Advocacy has become a central part of many survivors' lives. Organizations like the Thalidomide Society in the UK, the German Contergan Foundation, and various national survivor networks work to secure ongoing support, to raise awareness, to ensure the disaster isn't forgotten. These organizations also connect survivors, providing community for people whose experiences are unique and often isolating. Documentary filmmakers and journalists continue to tell survivors' stories. Notable works include the German filmmaker Nico von Glasow's documentary, Nobody's Perfect, which featured survivors from multiple countries discussing their lives with unflinching honesty. The British television series, Call the Midwife, devoted episodes to the thalidomide disaster, introducing the story to younger audiences who might never have heard of it. Research into thalidomide survivors' health continues. Long-term studies are tracking how they age, what complications develop, what interventions prove effective. This research has implications beyond thalidomide itself, offering insights into how people with significant congenital disabilities can be supported throughout the lifespan. Meanwhile, thalidomide use continues worldwide. Current estimates suggest that several million thalidomide prescriptions are filled annually, primarily for multiple myeloma and related cancers. Newer derivative drugs, lenalidomide and pomalidomide, are even more widely used. These derivatives were designed to be safer, and preliminary evidence suggests they may have less teratogenic potential, though they're still strictly regulated during pregnancy. The safety protocols have had mixed effectiveness. In countries with strong healthcare infrastructure and robust pharmaceutical regulation, new thalidomide embryopathy cases have been rare. The elaborate contraception requirements, the mandatory pregnancy testing, the restricted distribution, these measures work when properly implemented. But implementation varies dramatically. In Brazil, despite regulations, cases continue. In countries where thalidomide is manufactured and sold without adequate oversight, the risk remains high. Reports suggest that some pharmaceutical markets in South America and Africa sell thalidomide with minimal restrictions. The global pharmaceutical supply chain is complex and not uniformly regulated. Drugs manufactured for one market can find their way to others where controls are weaker. Advocacy groups argue that thalidomide should be banned entirely. They point to Brazil's ongoing cases as evidence that the drug cannot be safely managed. They argue that alternative treatments exist for most conditions thalidomide treats. The drug's continued availability, they contend, represents an unacceptable risk that prioritizes corporate profits over public health. Pharmaceutical companies and some medical professionals counter that thalidomide and its derivatives represent valuable therapeutic tools. They argue that in well-regulated environments with proper safeguards, the risk is minimal, while the benefit for seriously ill patients is substantial. They point to thousands of cancer patients whose lives have been extended by these medications. The debate remains unresolved, emblematic of broader tensions in pharmaceutical ethics. How do we balance individual therapeutic needs against population-level risks? Who decides which risks are acceptable? When a drug can both save lives and destroy them, depending on who takes it and when, what's the right regulatory response? In 2025, Chemie Grunenthal, now a large multinational pharmaceutical corporation, continues to operate. They manufacture pain medications primarily. The company has never faced criminal prosecution for thalidomide. Civil settlements were reached, but no executive was ever jailed. No individual was held personally accountable. This absence of criminal consequences remains, for many survivors and advocates, a profound injustice. Some survivors have achieved closure or something approaching it. They've built meaningful lives despite their disabilities. They've raised families, pursued careers, found peace with their circumstances. They view thalidomide as a part of their story, but not its defining chapter. Others remain angry at the company that created and marketed a dangerous drug. Angry at regulatory systems that failed to protect them, angry at societies that discriminated against them, angry at compensation schemes they view as grossly inadequate. Their anger is not bitterness, it's a justified response to preventable suffering. The thalidomide disaster transformed pharmaceutical regulation, but vulnerabilities remain. Drug approval processes are more rigorous now than in 1957. Post-market surveillance is more comprehensive. Teratogenic testing is mandatory, yet disasters still occur. The global pharmaceutical industry is larger and more complex than ever. New categories of drugs, biologics and gene therapies pose risks that traditional testing may not fully capture. The cultural memory of thalidomide varies. In Germany, the UK, and Australia, the disaster is well remembered, taught in medical schools, discussed in bioethics courses. In the United States, where the disaster was averted, awareness is lower. Many Americans have never heard of thalidomide. This amnesia is problematic. The lessons of thalidomide about the necessity of rigorous testing, transparent reporting, and vigilant regulation remain relevant. In 2023, researchers continued to explore thalidomide's mechanism at the molecular level. Understanding exactly how the drug works might enable the design of safer alternatives or inform the development of drugs that could reverse some of its effects. This research is painstaking, incremental, but potentially valuable. Survivors themselves are becoming historians of their own experience. Oral history projects have documented dozens of survivors' stories in detail. Archives hold collections of materials related to the disaster. Museums include thalidomide-related exhibits. This documentation ensures that future generations will know what happened, will understand the human cost of pharmaceutical failure. The question of how many survivors remain is difficult to answer precisely. Many severely affected individuals have died. Estimates suggest that fewer than half of those born with thalidomide embryopathy survived to age 60. Of those who have survived, all are now dealing with age-related health challenges. The survivor community is shrinking, aging, changing. In another 2 or 3 decades, there may be few survivors left to tell their stories directly. This impending loss makes documentation urgent. The lived experience of thalidomide survivors represents irreplaceable historical knowledge. Their perspectives on disability, on resilience, on systemic injustice, on adaptation and survival carry lessons that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of their birth. International cooperation among survivor organizations has strengthened. Annual conferences bring together survivors from multiple countries. These gatherings are part reunion, part advocacy strategy session, part mutual support group. They remind individual survivors that they're part of a global community united by shared experience. Advances in prosthetics and assistive technology have improved quality of life for many survivors. Modern prosthetics are lighter, more functional, more comfortable than those available in the 1960s and 70s. Robotic limbs with neural interfaces, still largely experimental, might eventually offer even greater functionality. But technology is expensive, and not all survivors have access to the latest developments. The next generation, children and grandchildren of survivors, carry their own relationship to the thalidomide legacy. Many survivors have had children, disproving early fears that they would be unable to do so. Importantly, thalidomide embryopathy is not genetic. It doesn't pass to subsequent generations. Survivors' children are born without the physical effects their parents carry, but they grow up shaped by their parents' experiences, by the accommodations and adaptations their families made, by the stories they inherited. Some of these second-generation individuals have become advocates themselves. They work to ensure continued support for their aging parents. They campaign for better disability rights. They keep the memory alive. Their involvement represents a transition from direct survivors to inheritors of the legacy. As we draw toward the close of this long night's journey, we reflect on what thalidomide means, what it has meant, what it continues to mean. The story is not ultimately about a drug. It's about trust and its betrayal, about the distance between intent and outcome, about how systems designed to protect can fail catastrophically, and about what happens in the aftermath of that failure. Thalidomide teaches us that safety is not an inherent property of molecules, but an emergent property of systems. A compound can be both harmless and devastating depending on context. The systems we build to test, approve, distribute, and monitor drugs must account for this complexity. They must be robust enough to catch problems before they cascade into disasters. They must be transparent enough that warning signs become visible. They must be responsive enough to act decisively when evidence of harm emerges. The disaster also reveals the limits of compensation. Money cannot restore absent limbs. Financial settlements cannot undo a lifetime of discrimination and difficulty. Legal remedies cannot replace what was taken. Justice, in cases like this, is necessarily incomplete. The best we can achieve is acknowledgement, support, and prevention of future similar tragedies. Prevention requires vigilance. It requires regulatory agencies with adequate resources and independence. It requires pharmaceutical companies that prioritize safety over profit, that embrace transparency over defensiveness. It requires healthcare providers who question, who report adverse events, who advocate for patients. It requires consumers who understand that all interventions carry risk and who demand clear information. The thalidomide survivors who remain are now in their early to mid-60s. They have lived extraordinary lives. Not because their disabilities made them extraordinary, though the assumption persists in public imagination, but because they navigated a world that was not built for them, that did not expect them, that often excluded them. They survived not just physically but socially, emotionally, economically. They built careers, raised families, created art, engaged in advocacy. They lived. Their lives refute every pessimistic prediction made in 1961. They demonstrate that disability, even profound disability, need not preclude a meaningful existence. But their struggles also demonstrate that disability in an unaccommodating world imposes enormous burdens. The difference between disability as tragic limitation and disability as manageable difference lies largely in how societies respond. Thalidomide's medical resurrection complicates the narrative. It would be simpler if the drug were purely villainous, something that should never have existed. But it does help people. The drug that destroyed developing limbs in embryos also saves lives when used appropriately in adults. This duality forces us to think carefully about pharmaceutical ethics, about acceptable risk, about who decides and on what basis. The story continues. New chapters are being written as survivors age, as research advances, as memories fade and are refreshed through documentation. The story will continue after the last survivor has died, because the lessons encoded in the thalidomide disaster remain relevant as long as we create and use pharmaceuticals. In museums, preserved bottles of Contergan and Distaval sit as artifacts of a particular moment when medicine's confidence exceeded its knowledge. They're reminders of fallibility, of the necessity of humility in the face of biological complexity. They're memorials to the thousands who were harmed and testaments to the millions who were protected by the regulatory reforms that followed. The survivors themselves remain the most powerful testament. Each one embodies a failure and a triumph. The failure of systems that should have protected them. The triumph of human adaptability and resilience. They carry in their bodies the physical evidence of what went wrong, and in their lives the evidence of what can be overcome. Some nights when the darkness feels heavy, when sleep seems elusive, it's worth remembering that history is not merely past. The choices made in 1957 echo through decades. The reforms enacted in 1962 protect people today. The advocacy of survivors in the 21st century shapes policy now. Time connects these moments, threads them into a continuous narrative of harm and healing, of failure and correction, of suffering and survival. The pharmaceutical industry is vastly larger now than it was in the thalidomide era. Thousands of compounds are in development at any moment. The potential for good is immense, treatments for diseases that were once death sentences. But the potential for harm remains. Vigilance cannot lapse. Testing cannot be rushed. Transparency cannot be sacrificed. The lesson of thalidomide is eternal. We must be careful because lives depend on it. As the early light begins to appear on the horizon, as this long recounting draws to a close, perhaps you've found some measure of understanding. Understanding of how a drug marketed as supremely safe became a byword for catastrophic failure. Understanding of how 10,000 children came to be born with bodies that would mark them forever. Understanding of how systems failed and were rebuilt. Understanding of how survivors adapted and endured. The story of thalidomide is a human story. Not merely a medical story or a corporate story or a regulatory story, though it is all of those. It's a story about vulnerability and power, about trust and its violation, about adaptation and survival. It's a story that needed telling, carefully and completely, so that the suffering might be honored and the lessons preserved. The survivors of the thalidomide disaster are growing old now. Their numbers dwindle, but their legacy extends far beyond their individual lives. Every drug that undergoes rigorous safety testing carries their influence. Every regulatory requirement that a pharmaceutical company must meet reflects lessons learned from their suffering. The architecture of drug safety, built largely in response to thalidomide, is their inadvertent gift to subsequent generations. And so we close with this thought. What happened between 1957 and 1962 should never have happened, but it did. And from that catastrophe emerged a determination that it should never happen again. That determination remains imperfect. Systems still fail. Disasters still occur. But the fundamental recognition that pharmaceutical safety requires constant vigilance, rigorous testing, and institutional humility, that recognition owes much to the generation that thalidomide crippled. May they rest easier, those who have passed. May those who remain find continued support and recognition. And may we, the inheritors of the systems built from their suffering, remember always the cost of complacency, the necessity of care, and the human consequences of chemical compounds synthesized in pursuit of profit and progress. The story continues. It always does. But for tonight, for this long night's exploration of a tragedy that quietly reshaped medicine, we can finally rest. The history has been told. The victims have been remembered. The lessons have been recounted. And perhaps in the telling, some measure of justice has been served. Sleep well, remember well, and hold close the knowledge that vigilance, though it cannot prevent all harm, remains our best defense against repeating the catastrophes of the past.